Hello everyone, welcome to YouTube. If you've stumbled across my corner of the internet, I feel quite sorry for you because it means you're doing politics A-level. Now, today I will be covering the whole of US politics, and this is for paper 3 of the A-level politics, which is the EdExcel spec. Now, before I start, I'm going to have a very, very important message. Please don't skip this bit. So this year, my college has had a very, very big problem with my politics teacher, to the point where I have had to teach myself US politics and everything else on the second year politics spec. That means that some of the things I say may not be exactly correct, and I might be missing bits out. Please, if you spot any mistakes in this video, or you have other things that might help me or other people, please write them down in the comments. That'd be much appreciated, because I'm just trying to get through this A-level, if I'm honest. Right, so now on to US politics. Oh, also, you might have spotted that we have a little environment change. Look at this, vlogs with Emily. So you are actually on my bunk bed now, because I'm sharing a room with my little sister, and you can see all the revision has had to squeeze behind me, and I actually have politics revision on the ceiling. It has got to that point. Lovely. So we're going to start US politics by talking about the US Constitution. This might be a very long video, so get yourself a cup of tea and let's do this. Okay, so the key features of the US Constitution are separation of powers, which is stated in Articles 1, 2 and 3, codification, unlike the UK, checks and balances, which are stated in Articles 1, 2 and 3, federalism, which is stated in Article 1 and Amendment 10, the vagueness, which means it's a bit easier than the UK, vagueness, which means it's easier than the UK to sort of interpret. It's very wide. Limited government, which is stated in the Bill of Rights. I apologise. Oh my goodness. Hay fever. We love it. Limited government, which is stated in the Bill of Rights and by the enumerated powers. Bipartisanship, which means that 2/3 majority is required for amendments. Okay, let's talk about, where should we go next? Let's talk about checks and balances in a bit more detail. So, the executive can appoint the judiciary, but the judiciary can declare action unconstitutional of the executive. I literally just had to pause to have a sneezing break. We love exams. Right, so the judiciary can declare the legislative unconstitutional, but in return, the legislative can refuse to appoint and overrule Supreme Court decisions. The legislative can override executive vetoes and impeach the executive, whereas the executive can veto legislation. Right, so arguments with federalism. So in some ways, the US is federal. For example, we have the Texas versus US case in 2016. The testing of online voting in West Virginia and appealing to the Supreme Court isn't a right in state courts, so they remain important. The state courts remain important because going to the Supreme Court isn't a right. I said that a bit weirdly first, sorry. Right, not federal. There's terrorism and disasters where only federal courts have resources. For example, Hurricane Harvey, and things like Obamacare can overtake individual states' laws. Okay, so now we're going to talk about strengths and weaknesses of the US Constitution. So, strengths: citizens' rights are protected, e.g. via the Bill of Rights, and this is similar to the Human Rights Act in the UK, which was initiated in 1998. In non-partisan interpretation, so for example, Obamacare got through because of the Supreme Court. Flexibility, so I can never read this. Objefel versus Hodge, same-sex marriage, legal in every state. I think that was 2015. States remain largely independent. For example, they have their own individual laws on things like the death penalty and marijuana uses. Weaknesses would be that the state's power are diminishing. I can't speak today. For example, things like Obamacare get in the way of states' individual laws. The role of the Supreme Court grants a lot of power to 9 unelected justices, and that is similar to the justices in the UK and also the Lords and House of Lords. And the amendment process limits change. So we've got the right to bear arms, and this is unlike the UK, which has a flexible constitution, so change to it is a lot easier. Now we're going to talk about a few, actually just the one key argument. So, is the US federal today? Now I've already touched upon this, but this is going to go into a bit more detail. So, on the one hand, yes, the US is federal today because each state is able to decide upon and enforce a wide variety of laws, e.g. recreational use of marijuana is legal in 9 states. Number 2, the Supreme Court has ruled in favour of states against the federal government, e.g. Texas versus US 2016, overturning Obama's executive DAPA order. Electoral practices vary and are developing, e.g. testing of online voting in West Virginia. Political parties remain broad churches as both Democrats and Republicans have dramatically different ideologies across the country. For example, the Freedom Caucus in the Reps is considerably further right than members such as Susan Collins. Appealing the Supreme Court. Appealing to the Supreme Court isn't a right, so state courts remain important. E.g., in 2017, the Supreme Court refused to hear a case on whether sexual discrimination in the workplace extends to discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. On the other hand, the US is not federal because the growth of federal government seems to increasingly encroach upon states' reserved powers. E.g., in Kentucky, a clerk was imprisoned for refusing to issue same-sex marriage licenses after it was legalised. Number 2, the EC and the House of Representatives place great importance on a few states. For example, California is worth 55 electoral college votes, Texas 38 and Florida 29. So these states are heavily targeted by candidates, often at the expense of the 7 states, which are worth just 3 each. Number 3, only the federal government has the resources to deal with terrorist attacks, market crashes and natural disasters. For example, Hurricane Harvey and Irma may have caused upwards of $200 billion of damage. And finally, the Supreme Court has also ruled for federal government, further centralising political power. For example, in upholding Obamacare in the NFIB versus Sebelius case, the federal government seems to have vast power over healthcare. So that is the first topic out of 6. We're 6 of the way through. Right, now let's talk about Congress. So we'll go straight to the structure. So it's split essentially into the House of Representatives and the Senate. Let's talk about the House of Representatives first. So there are exactly 435 members. Now, in order to be on the House of Reps, you have to be a citizen for 7 years, you have to be 25 years old, and you only serve a 2-year term. Now that is a lot less than the MPs in the UK get with their 5-year term due to the Fixed Parliaments Act of 2011. In the Senate, there are 100 members, that is 2 per state. They have to be 30 years old and a citizen for 9 years. They serve a 6-year term with 1/3 of the Senate being elected every 2 years. Lovely. So let's talk about their powers now. So they have concurrent powers, which are things like confirming the new vice president, passing legislation, declaring war and constitutional amendments. And the House of Representatives and the Senate have their own individual powers. So the individual powers for the House of Representatives is that they can elect presidents if the Electoral College is deadlocked, and they can bring cases of impeachment. The Senate can confirm presidential appointments, appointments, ratify treaties, try cases of impeachment, and elect the vice president if the electoral college is deadlocked. So they have a few functions, 3 main ones though: representation, oversight, and legislative. So let's talk about them in reverse order. We'll go for legislative first. So in terms of the path a bill has to take, so you can start in either the House of Reps or the Senate. You first have an intro, then it goes straight to the committee, then timetabling, the second reading and vote, third reading and vote, and then a conference committee. Then it will either go to the House for approval or the Senate for approval, and then presidential action. Now, a president can essentially just leave it on his desk and not do anything. Up to him. And it's exactly the same for the Senate, but in reverse. Lovely. So, good things about the legislative function is that it promotes bipartisanship. Scrutiny, it protects rights and tries to stop the tyranny of the majority. However, bipartisanship doesn't always work, which leads to gridlock. It is slow, and re-election over legislation happens. So now the oversight function, they have the powers to declare war, for example, World War II. Funding budget, for example, the 2018 shutdowns. Lovely. Executive investigation, so Russia and the election. Lovely. I'm saying lovely too much, sorry. Impeachment, so Clinton in 1998. The Senate ratifying federal justices and other appointments, and Senate ratifying treaties, for example, the START Treaty of 2010. Right, so for representative function, you have pressure groups and lobbyists, which are to do with financing candidates and stuff like that, and also about the ideologies of the different parties. You have congressional elections, which are good for name recognition, putting legislation on the record. They'll happen in the midterms. You've got gerrymandering, lots of stuff to do with that, which we'll come on to later. Congressional caucuses, which show factions in parties and state/issue factors. Yes, so next we have constituency, so state or district ideology. And the House of Representatives, short elections, so they're more responsive. And the representative function in terms of party and partisanship shows ideology, leadership and discipline. Now, also in terms of representation, women are only 21% of Congress, but 51% of the population. So, are parties important? Well, you could say yes they are, because they have increased partisanship, so fall in legislative outcomes. They produce divided governments and control significant roles, especially in the House. But they are unimportant because they are broad churches with lots of different ideologies and a massive spectrum. Their discipline is weak, particularly in state legislatures. And unanimous consent gives individual senators power. So let's talk about the effectiveness of Congress. The power of investigation, which is a joint power. So this is effective because Congress can investigate any aspect of the executive branch and highlight problems that need correcting, but it is ineffective as investigations end in recommendations and Congress can't bring criminal proceedings. They can only apply pressure. In terms of ratifying justices, which is only a Senate power, they are effective as the Senate must approve nominees. They are usually thoroughly... What on earth is that? Vettled? I have no idea what that says. If anyone can read my writing... Oh, it's backwards, isn't it? Never mind, it's that word. Oh well, it's backwards. Emily doesn't know how to control a camera. Literally no idea. Vetted. The F shouldn't reject nominations often. If anyone can explain what I was trying to say there, Please leave it down in the comments. I have no idea what I meant. The Senate is reactive and they can't... Oh dear. Emily still can't control a camera. And we're back. Come on, please don't drop the phone again, Emily. The Senate is reactive and they can't continually reject nominations, otherwise they look partisan. So, in terms of electing presidents, if the EC is deadlocked, which is just the House's power, this was effective in 1800 and 1824, but not been used since. Oh, and it's used just in case, so it's not like a real power. So in terms of impeachment, it is an effective threat, but in all 3 cases the president was not found guilty. And in terms of declaring war, it has been used 11 times, but they have little choice in authorising action. So example 9/11. Right, now we get to the fun bit of comparing the legislatures of the UK Parliament and UK Congress. So UK Parliament can declare war, passes legislation based on the leading party's manifesto, scrutinises the government, which usually hold a majority in the House of Commons. A vote of no confidence can remove the government and force election, whereas US Congress can also declare war, but it passes legislation based on the president, not the governing party, and its own electoral platform scrutinises the executive, which is separate from Congress. And a president can be impeached, but fixed terms mean the vice president will take control. So, the House of Commons. Yes, so the House of Commons is the more powerful chamber. It has a strong backbench power and strong constitutional links, but it also has strong party whips, executive dominance, and government majority in the committees. Now, this can be compared to the House of Representatives in the US, which has strong constitutional links, rep by population. So they're represented by the population in each state, and they have effective control by majority party, but they have a short election cycle. The Speaker means minorities can be ignored, and a shared legislative power. The House of Lords has more time to debate, reduced party discipline, and will challenge the House of Commons, but they are unelective and include hereditary peers. The Salisbury Convention limits what they can do, and the size of the membership is not brilliant. The Senate needs unanimous consent. It can filibuster. It has 6-year terms, which is a lot longer than the House of Representatives, so they can get things done, and they represent state interests. But they have shared legislative power. Unanimous consent can cause gridlock, and overrepresentation of small states and vice versa. So, in general, the similarities between the UK and the US legislatures is that they are bicameral, they have limited powers to scrutinise the executive, and they have strong constitutional links in lower chambers. However, the level of party discipline, equality of the powers of the 2 houses, and legislative output is completely different. Whew, that was quite a big chunk. So now we get on to the president. So, powers. We have constitutional powers, for example, appointing federal justices, receiving ambassadors, executing laws, granting pardons, being the commander-in-chief, State of Union address, making treaties, and signing or vetoing legislation. We also have informal powers, for example, executive orders, just like Trump's executive orders and Obamacare. They are in charge of the vice president and the cabinet. They're in charge of national events, for example, George W. Bush and 9/11, and they have an electoral mandate. So, for example, Obama had 53% of the vote, whereas Trump had 46% of the vote. Now, you could say that the founding fathers envisioned their president as a personification of the nation. That rhymes. Nice and easy to remember. So, the vice president announces the electoral college votes, is an acting president, presiding officer in the Senate, and casts a vote in the Senate to break a tie. The cabinet are basically mayors, governors from Congress or university academics appointed by the president. They have meetings in order to discuss information, debate, monitor Congress, and all about openness and team spirit. But they don't really get together very often. They have no opportunities for progression. Cabinet officers have no executive powers. The president is first, whereas in the UK, the Prime Minister is primus inter pares. And EdExcel. Which brings me on to EdExcel. So you have essentially like four parts of this. You have the White House office, which is the link with the cabinet. The NSC, which is military foreign policy. OMB, which is federal department spending. And the Brownlow Committee. So, Congress and Supreme Court. Now, these have powers of persuasion. For example, Obama gun control, divided government, presidential action, so Obama immigration, judicial review, Supreme Court and Obama's DAPA, executive order. Appointments, separation of powers, for example, Trump and Obamacare. And elections, so veto override 9/11 victims bill in 2016. In terms of the president and foreign policy, it's better to have one representative to go over to other countries, as Congress is slow and indecisive. And Obama's negotiation of Iran deal without approval of Congress. The limitations of the president include popularity, national events, for example, shootings for Obama, and the election cycle being, midterms and stuff. So, some key arguments now. Number one, is the cabinet important? Well, yes it is, because it is the most important people in the executive. The cabinet contains all the heads of the 15 executive departments. The president chairs the meetings. They can fulfill a number of functions, and some presidents hold frequent meetings, for example, President Reagan. But they are not important because Article 2 puts all executive power in the president. They have no collective responsibility. They are neither equals nor rivals. They have divided loyalties, and EdExcel is the main advice-giving source for the president. So, is the president's power still to persuade? Well, you could argue yes, because they have no formal disciplinary hold over Congress. Party discipline in Congress can't guarantee votes for the president. Divided governments, dependency upon Congress for legislation, confirmatory votes of appointments and treaty ratification, and direct authority has limited use. However, partisanship means opposition members are unlikely to be persuaded. They have lower approval ratings and therefore persuasion is less effective, and their second terms are generally harder. So differences between Obama and Trump in terms of what they set out to do. So Obama was successful in healthcare reform, stimulating the economy, ending the Iraq War, reforming nuclear weapons, but he was unsuccessful in the minimum wage, gun control, and immigration reform. Trump, so far, has been successful on tax reform, but has been unsuccessful in repealing and replacing Obamacare. Other things that we are not too sure about yet is the building of the wall, which is happening at the moment. Scary. Immigration reform, travel ban, renegotiating NAFTA, negotiating an Iran deal, and applying tariffs. So now we're going to compare the US President to the UK Prime Minister. So the UK Prime Minister is the head of government, whereas the US President is the head of state and the government. The UK Prime Minister gets a party mandate from being the leader of a majority party and serving any number of terms, whereas the President has a personal mandate from direct election and can only serve 2 terms. In reality, the Prime Minister acts as sovereign as a leader with a majority. In theory, this is the Queen. But in reality and theory, the US President is sovereign with constitutional powers. The UK Prime Minister is primus inter pares, whereas the US President is a singular executive. The UK Prime Minister is a Commander-in-Chief through the royal prerogative, whereas the US President is a Commander-in-Chief to armed forces through the Constitution. The Prime Minister draws up legislative agenda and writes the Queen's speech, whereas the State of Union address is used by the President, but has no power to enforce this through Congress. It's just like a wish list. The Prime Minister has no need to veto legislation, whereas the US President has the power to veto. So, similarities is that executive power depends on control of the legislative, and the role of the legislative is to scrutinise policy proposals, and both can remove the government, but it's not an exercise power. Well, mostly. The difference is that separation of powers in the US versus sovereign power in the UK. The government in the UK can be removed via a vote of no confidence, whereas in the US it is via impeachment, and the State of Union address is a suggestion, but the Queen's speech is an agenda. Getting there, slowly. Now let's talk about elections. So, the process has essentially seven, I can do 7, oh my god, I can't do maths. 7 different stages. So number 1 is the invisible primaries. Now these are good because they have a range of candidates and it increases scrutiny, but are bad because it is quite lengthy. Number 2 is primaries and caucuses. This is good for federalism and intra-party choice, but they have a low turnout. Number 3 is national party conventions. Now these are good because they're televised, which increases scrutiny, but they are already known candidates, so it's sort of a waste of time. Number 4 is the campaign. Number 5 is the election day/days, depending on the states and stuff. Number 6 is the electoral college, where they get where they get certain points based on the votes. Number 7 is inauguration, and the EC votes are announced by the Vice President. The President must be 35, serve only 2 terms, a resident for 14 years, and a natural-born citizen. So, let's talk about the Electoral College. Now, California has 55 ECVs out of the 380 ECVs available, and that is not proportional. For example, North Dakota has 3 ECVs, so, but that means, on the other hand, that small population parties are still important. That makes no sense. Small states with small populations, there you go, not small population parties. I'm tired. The ECV promotes a 2-party system. Swing states become overly powerful, however. It works as the Founding Fathers intended it to, or at least that's what we think. 48 states and winner takes all, Maine and Nebraska being the 2 that are allocated by district, and it is dependent on population. So, incumbency advantages. So, why would you vote in a president that's already been in here before? We've got a single candidate, risk aversion, presumed success, campaign experience, government control, fundraising, name recognition. In terms of campaign donations, you have the 1974 Federal Election Campaign Act, which puts limits on the campaign donations that can be raised. PACs, or Political Action Committees, raise hard money, but this is limited to $5,000 per candidate. And super PACs are unlimited but can't control the campaign. The 2002 Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act banned soft money and also placed restrictions on advertising. The 2008 election was the first election to have over $1 billion in campaign donations. And the 2010 Citizens United versus FEC was the development of super PACs. And finally, electoral reform. So, swing states have too much importance, small states are overrepresented, third parties are ignored, the EC system is outdated, you have rogue voters, winner takes all distorts the votes, and the winner may not have the majority of the vote. All of those are valid reasons for electoral reform. So now let's compare it to the UK. So similarities between the US and the UK elections is that it is a 2-party system. First The first past the post means that the winner might not have the majority of the popular vote. Both executives in place via indirect elections, chances of re-election of incumbent high, and popular third-party policies are stolen by the two main parties, which sustains a two-party system. However, the UK has a direct election for MPs only, whereas the USA electorate votes for Congress and the President separately. Elections are local and devolved levels in the UK involve more than two parties, whereas the success of third parties in the USA is limited at all levels. Role of campaign finance is higher in the USA, and there are more electoral systems in the UK. If you want to revise that, go watch the UK video and there'll be a section on devolution. So we've got campaign finance. So in the UK in 2010, the Conservatives raised £16.6 million, whereas Labour raised £8 million. In 2015, the Conservatives raised £15.6 million, whereas Labour raised £12.1 million. And in 2017, the Conservatives raised £18.6 million, whereas Labour raised £11 million. You can see in all of those instances that the Conservatives raised more money than Labour. Does that mean that money is the defining factor? Who knows? In the US, in 2008, the Republicans raised $358 million, whereas the Democrats raised $560 million. In 2012, the Republicans raised $450 million, whereas the Democrats raised $721 million. And in 2016, the Republicans raised $564 million, whereas the Democrats raised $969 million. Now you can see a big difference in terms of the amount of money that's spent in the UK and the amount of money that's spent in the US. But as you can see from those three statistics in the US, it doesn't necessarily mean that the party with the most campaign finance will win, as shown by the 2016 stats for the US. So, state funding encourages pluralism over elitism, it is fairer to third parties and reduces public apathy, but it is less reliant on parties, so less responsive to voters, and it challenges party independence. Now we get to talk about parties and pressure groups, everyone's favourite bit. Now we have 2 more sections left. If you got this far, congrats! It's just gone over half an hour. Lovely! So let's talk about party organisation in Congress. So we have things like congressional leaders. So we have at the top the Speaker of the House. Then we have the Majority Leader and the Majority Whip, the Minority Leader and the Minority Whip. And that's in the House. Now in the Senate we have the Vice President at the top, then the President pro tempore, and then underneath the President pro tempore we have again the Majority Leader and the Majority Whip, and the Minority Leader then the Minority Whip. We also have caucuses, congressional committees and the whips, which are more powerful in the House. So let's talk about Democrats. So the Democrats are seen as progressive. They are supportive of abortion access and same-sex marriage. They are in favour of tax cuts with a focus on middle and lower classes, and in favour of federal minimum wage. Now there are strands of Democrats. So you have the Conservatives, which are seen as more socially conservative than economically, and these are sort of known as blue dogs. You have the moderates, which are generally minority groups and blue-collar workers, and you have the liberals, which are all for government intervention and welfare systems. So now let's talk about the Republicans. We have tax cuts across the board, so including from the top earners. The sanctity of life, which is anti-abortion, conservative social views, minimum government intervention, so laissez-faire, overturning Obamacare. Now we have the fiscal conservatives, which are low tax, limited intervention in economy and free trade. The moderates, which are Republicans in names only, or rhinos. And the social conservatives. Now these are the religious right, anti-immigration, anti-abortion, sort of further right. And then we only have to talk about interest groups. So interest groups, we have policy groups, for example, Unidos US, professional groups, for example, NAB, and single issue groups like the NRA. So interest groups are good because they can represent minorities, can give info to committees, they are good at protesting and increasing participation, but are bad because they increase the tyranny of the majority and they have lobbying, which is not the most brilliant thing. So a couple of key arguments now. Is the US a two-party system? Well, on the one hand, it is a two-party system because they have first past the post, winner takes all, third-party policies are adopted by the main parties, broad church ideology, the electoral college as a system, and federalism. But it is not a two-party system because of state parties, the breadth of the parties, third-party versus third-party vote share, not versus, vote share tripled in 2016, and some states only have one party. So let's talk about similarities between Labour and the Democrats. So the similarities are that they have an interest in minimum wage and workers' rights and higher government intervention in economy and welfare, but Labour are more left-wing and are more willing to increase taxes on the rich. So the Conservatives and the Republicans have similarities such as no government intervention or limited government intervention, especially in economy and welfare, and increase of defence spending. However, the Conservatives are more socially liberal, whereas Republicans have a greater affiliation to religion. So factions in the Labour Party are things like Momentum and Progress. In Conservatives, these are things like Thatcherites and the 1922 Committee. In Democrats, we have the Progressives and the Blue Dogs, and in the Republicans, we have Rhinos and the Freedom Caucus. Now, in terms of power, the US and the UK are similar because they access executive and legislation through lobbying, and they have a free media. But they are different because court cases are more commonly brought to by intergroups. No idea. In the US. Oh, interest groups. I get it. Shorthand. Lovely. And mass protests are more complex in the USA. Now, the methods are similar because we have protests and demos, lobbying and media, but the US is more involved and has more money in election campaigns, and legal action is more important in the USA because it is more likely to go to the judiciary than in the UK. And in terms of influence, the US and the UK are similar because they give evidence to committees, use of courts, more members and money, and more influence. Whereas the Supreme Court in the USA has the final approval, the UK can go to the ECHR, or at least we can at the moment. And judicial rulings in the UK can be ignored more, and there are more access points in the US. Right, final topic now. Yay! We have the Supreme Court and civil rights. Right, so I don't even know where to start. This is quite a big mind map. Let's go for membership and appointment. So, membership and appointment ensures independence, media influence, politicised by President and the Senate, ensures individuals are qualified, and accountability. So, the Supreme Court has 9 members. That is 1 Chief Justice and 8 Associate Justices. In terms of appointment, you have a vacancy, then a presidential nomination, and then some other stages that aren't necessary, which are ABA rating and Senate Judiciary Committee, although they're not constitutional, they're in there sometimes, and then a full Senate vote. So the structure of federal courts is so you start at the US district courts, and there are 94 districts. Then you go to the US Court of Appeals with 13 circuits, and then the US Supreme Court, which is just the one. So we have judicial philosophies such as imperial, political, or judicial. We have the loose constructionists, which are generally liberal and abide by a living constitution, whereas strict constructionists are more originalist and socially conservative. So let's have a look at rights protection. So we have the Roe versus Wade case in 1973, which links to abortion. The Gonzales versus Oregon case in 2006, which is about euthanasia. The 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote. The 15th Amendment, which gave black people the right to vote. And the 13th and 14th Amendment, which gave all people equal protection under law. You also have affirmative action and the Obergefell versus Hodge case in 2015, which gave same-sex marriage to all states. So the Supreme Court has checked congressional power via healthcare reform, so for example upholding healthcare, Obamacare, and immigration, so the US versus Arizona in 2012. In terms of public policy, we have again the Obergefell versus Hodge case, which set a new policy. The Texas versus US 2016 case, which struck down Obama's executive order for DAPA, which struck down presidential legislation. And the NFIB versus Sebelius 2012 case, while the Supreme Court upheld Obamacare. So we have interpretation of the Bill of Rights. So is the Third Amendment out of date? Maybe, but it could be interpreted as the right to privacy. And the 13th Amendment contradicts Guantanamo, I still can't say that, Guantanamo Bay, and the death penalty. So we also have judicial review and judicial activism. So judicial activism, elected branches often don't talk about controversial topics. So you have the Bush versus Gore case of 2002, which awarded presidency to Bush, and the Roe versus Wade case in 1973 upholding abortion rights. You could argue it is judicial restraint. Activism undermines neutrality and instead ceases. You could also argue that it is imperial, as it allows overruling of executive branches and it is almost impossible to overturn. Now, those two things also link to judicial review. Now, judicial review declares unconstitutionality and therefore makes them null and void. You have the rule of 4. So you need a majority of 4 out of 9 justices to get a case heard. The Fletch versus Peck case in 1810 and the Marbury versus Madison case in 1803. And those two things stated judicial review and brought it into action. So it was kind of a power they gave themselves. So judiciaries compared. So in terms of power, the UK Supreme Court was established in Constitutional Reform Act in 2005 and opened in 2009, whereas the US Supreme Court was established in Article 3 of the US Constitution. The UK has greater separation of powers, whereas the US Supreme Court is a separate branch of government. The UK means that judicial review is not the same as overruling Parliament, whereas judicial review gives quasi-sovereignty power to strike down elected branches in the US Supreme Court. In the UK Supreme Court, judicial review allows the Supreme Court to interpret the actions and laws of the government, whether they have acted ultra vires, whereas judicial review in the US Supreme Court allows the Supreme Court to interpret the Constitution and compare the laws and actions to limits therein. UK citizens could appeal onwards to the ECJ or the ECHR, at least we can at the moment, and whereas the final court of appeal in the USA is the Supreme Court, you can't go any further. The UK has a lack of sovereignty, but government is unlikely to ignore Supreme Court ruling, whereas the US Supreme Court has a lack of enforcement power, but the government is unlikely to ignore ruling. So in terms of independence, we have some similarities between both Supreme Courts. Now these are independence of buildings and personnel, appointment process, justices have security of tenure, pressure from elective branches and interest groups, and willing to rule against government. Whereas the US salaries are protected by the Constitution in the UK, but in the UK the Supreme Court budget is set by an independent Ministry of Justice. The US appointment is political, whereas the UK uses independent judicial appointments community, and the US can overrule elective branches, whereas the UK cannot. Okay, so effectiveness of rights protection in the UK. So good things, effective things in the UK. The Human Rights Act gives justices a codified document to make rulings. The UK citizens can appeal beyond the Supreme Court to the ECHR. Parliament is unlikely to ignore justices because they have a moral authority. However, Parliament remains sovereign. The ECHR rulings have been ignored in the UK, for example, Hurst versus UK prison rights, and the role of justices in the Supreme Court is far less widely understood. Now, in the USA, rights protection is effective because constitutional foundation giving it a quasi-sovereign power. The Constitution is the basis for rulings, which is difficult to change, and rulings are unlikely to be ignored. However, rulings have been ignored. For example, Guantanamo Bay. The court can hear relatively few cases a year, so about 80 or 90 out of thousands. Citizens have no right to have their case heard in the Supreme Court, and judges seem more ideologically motivated. So, in the UK, we have some examples of abortion. So, application by Northern Ireland Human Rights Committee for Judicial Review, 2017, which was dismissed. And in the USA, the Whole Women's Health Hellerstit? That must be German. I have no idea. 2016, abortion upheld. For gay rights in the UK, we have Lee versus Ashes, the baking thing, in 2008. And in the USA, we have the Masterpiece Cake Shop. A lot of cakes to do with gay rights, my God. We have the Masterpiece Cake Shop versus Colorado Civil Rights Committee in 2018 as well. For euthanasia in the UK, we have the Nicholson versus Ministry of Justice in 2014, and in the USA it's the Gonzalez versus Oregon case in 2016, which was successful. We have, for terrorism in the UK, we have the HM Treasury versus Ahmed in 2010, and in the USA we have an example of Boudidzine versus Bush of 2008. So effectiveness of interest groups in protection of civil rights in the UK. It is increasingly relevant in court cases. The UK respects civil rights while not entrenched in one document. It predates the US Bill of Rights, and increasing devolution gives more access points to interest groups. Now in the USA, groups can more frequently bring cases to the Supreme Court. A codified Bill of Rights made rights clearer and more ingrained, and a greater number of access points for interest groups than in the UK. Way, we got through all the topics. Now that we're not done yet, just give me a second to climb off this bunk bed and I'll explain why. Way, we're off the bunk bed now. The bunk bed is behind me, so now I get to tell you about some more specific examples. Now we've got loads of these, and I've just essentially stuck them on stars like this on my wardrobe. So let's start over here. We have a 62% turnout in 2008, 50% turnout in 1996, 67% turnout in 1960. Kansas 2016 caucus turnout was 5.5%, and there was a 54% turnout in the 2016 election. Now, a black male born in 1991 has a 69% chance of spending time in prison at some point in his life. 5 presidents won without winning the popular vote, the most recent one being Trump, and the one previous to that I think was Al Gore. The Constitution was released in 1787. $72 million was raised in campaign funds in 1976. Women tend to lean more to the Democrat Party by 52% to 36%. We have the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act of 2002, and that regulates soft money advertising restrictions. We have Emily's List, which is a group representing women's interests, particularly in Congress, with abortion rights, and it has 3 million members. So Trump was endorsed by 12 senators and 29 House reps, and Obama in 2007 was endorsed by Oprah Winfrey. I'm just going to get down on the floor now. In 2016, Sanders had 20 minutes, Clinton had 121 minutes, and Trump had 327 minutes of TV coverage for their primaries. George W. Bush was endorsed by 41 GOP senators, 175 House members, and 27 governors. I'm sorry, this bit of the video is going to be really shaky. So we had a 55% turnout in 1980. $5.3 billion of campaign funds were raised in 2008. In 2004, Democrat primaries turnout was 9.5%. In 2008, Democrat primaries turnout was 19.5%. And the Democratic caucus in Idaho had 21.9% turnout in 2016. $240 million in campaign funds were raised in 2000. Now for some more pressure groups. We have Rock the Vote, which is interested in getting young people to vote. So in 2008, they registered about 2.8 million young voters. We have Black Lives Matter campaign, which Bernie Sanders supports and got the support of the Democratic National Convention. Texas versus US 2016 overturned Obama's DAPA executive order. Iran deal 2015, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, or AIPAC, lobbied Democrats to override Obama's deal but failed. Obamacare of 2010, Democrat whips managed to get all senators and 2 independents to vote for it, but groups such as AMA supported the bill. Women make up 23% of Congress, but 51% of the population. I believe I've already said that one. In 1974, President Ford pardoned Nixon for any Watergate scandal crimes. The NRA funds candidates, has 5 million members, and $3.3 million was spent on lobbying in 2014. And they're associated with the Political Victory Fund. The Roe versus Wade 1973 case was about abortion rights. We have the AARP, which has over 37 million members. It's about healthcare bills and was particularly influential in the Obama presidency, particularly with Obamacare. Recreational use of marijuana is legal in 9 states. The Sierra Club is another pressure group. It is focused on environmental issues, has 2.8 million members, and has opposition from big oil firms. The Obergefell versus Hodge case in 2015, oh my god, I can't speak, legalised same-sex marriage in every single state. In 2012, only 12 states received campaign events because the rest were considered safe seats. Online voting has been tested in West Virginia. The Jeff Sessions 2000 resignation was because he had to resign from the Senate to become Attorney General, separation of powers. Obama won 93% of African American votes in 2012. And finally, the Democrats repealed the Don't Ask, Don't Tell Act of 2010 and supported the Obergefell versus Hodge case. Yeah, that's it. Well done. If you got to the end of this video, I'm incredibly proud. I hope your exams go really well. Again, if there has been any mistakes in this video, please correct me down in the comments. And if there's anything I haven't included, please again include that down in the comments and we can help each other out and hopefully all get decent grades in politics this year. Goodbye.